Hi, this is Bobby Jo Williams, and I will be talking to you about my RBI writing article evaluation. The article I chose was titled The Effects of Early Writing Intervention Delivered Within a Data-Based Instruction Framework. It was using an adapted research-based program from the Center on Accelerating Student Learning, Handwriting, and Spelling. The purpose of the study, the subjects that were studied, there were 46 participants, 22 were placed in a treatment group, 24 placed into a control group. The ages ranged from 6 to 9 in grades 1 through 3. There were both male and female participants. The SES status was the 43 were receiving free and reduced lunch. Ethnicity ranged from American Indian, having 1 participant, African Americans, 28, Asian, 3, Hispanic, 4, and white, 10. There were 18 ELL students involved in the study. Special education services ranged from the following. There were 27 students out of the 46 that had an IEP. 8 of those were identified ASD. 11 were identified as students needing alternative programming. 1 was identified SLI, and 4 were identified OHI. The dependent variable in this research study was writing and writing transcription skills, for example, handwriting and spelling. The hypothesis: students receiving research-based early writing intervention with DBI would outperform control students in their writing achievement both on basic and more complex writing skills, indicating that transcription skills can lead to improved overall writing proficiency. The measurement of the variable was done through curriculum-based measures, or known as CBM, throughout the rest of this presentation, and the Woodcock-Johnson 3 tests of achievements. So the reason they conducted this research study was that they determined, as we all know, that writing skills are essential for school and success. Students with at-risk or students who have disabilities are especially likely to experience difficulty with writing, and they require high-quality, effective interventions. Intensive, individualized instruction they feel is not being implemented in current special education practices, particularly for writing. So specifically, they wanted to see if using data-based instruction, or DBI, to drive the individualized writing interventions could improve this, because they're saying that they were not being used. So the intervention is taken from an adapted research-based early writing intervention from the Center on Accelerating Student Learning, Handwriting, and Spelling program. And in this particular program, there are 7 activities that support handwriting and spelling. And we'll talk about them in this slide right here. So the first part of the early writing intervention from CASL is the phonics, or the warm-up. In this particular activity, students identify sounds and locations of target letters in the words. The instructor would say the first sound of apple is A. What sound? What letter makes the A sound? Then during the alphabet practice, students practice writing the letters and words with the letters. The instructor would model writing each target letter by tracing it with a finger, and then students would trace and copy the letters and write the letters from memory. The third activity was word building, where students generated words by adding a letter to the beginning of rhymes. The instructor would model how to make a real word using a rhyme on a card, for example, by adding a letter in front of the rhyme. After he would model, students were to make as many real words as possible. Then during the word study activity, students studied spelling words through 5 steps. They would say the word in its letters, say the word in letters from memory without looking, say the letters again, write the word from memory, and then check to see if the word is correct. During the alphabet rockets activity, students copied sentences with accuracy and fluency as many times as possible within 3 minutes. They would target letters that were already covered in the alphabet practice. During the writing activity, students would write a story based on a story prompt, using handwriting and spelling skills that they practiced up to this point. And in the final one, the word sort, the instructor would demonstrate how to categorize words by target features, and then show the students how to check them. Then he would have the students state a rule for the patterns and sort the words. This particular step actually reminds me of the Words Their Way program that we have implemented in our school. So I talked about how this was given in a DBI framework, so I'm going to explain to you what the DBI framework is. It reminds me of actually progress monitoring that occurs in our special education classrooms and our general education classrooms. But in this particular case, there were very specific steps where number one was to establish present level of performance. And in this case, they administered and scored 3 of the CBMW, or the writing prompts, and then they graphed the median baseline score. The second step was to set a long-term goal. So they wanted to be ambitious about this goal. They multiplied the number of intervention weeks by the weekly growth rates expected and added the baseline score to it. Then step 3 was to implement high-quality instruction with fidelity. They implemented the early writing intervention activities described previously. Step 4 was then to monitor student progress, and CBMW progress monitoring data was collected twice a week. They added a trend line to the graph representing the student's growth rate after collecting 8 of the data points. Step 5 was to use decision rules to evaluate student progress and instructional effectiveness. The tutors made instructional decisions by comparing the trend line to the goal line. If the trend line was steeper than the goal line, they increased the goal. If the trend line matched the goal line, they kept the intervention as is. And if the trend line was less steep than the goal line, they changed the instruction by implementing steps 6 and 7. For step 6, they generated a hypothesis to individualize instruction. So the tutors synthesized the information, including the CBMW samples and the observation notes, and then they made decisions using that data. Step 7 is where they make instructional changes based on the hypothesis. So they may have changed the setting, they may have changed the target letters, the sounds, words based on the information from the graph. And then in this particular next step, they decided whether they needed to repeat the steps 1 through 4 over again or continue with the intervention. So let's talk about the intervention. The intervention was done by randomly assigning students to either a treatment group or a control group. The treatment group, they received research-based early writing intervention within a DBI framework for 30 minutes, 3 times a week for 12 weeks. The control group was business as usual for the duration of the intervention. The methodology or measurement, the study took place in 3 elementary schools in large urban Midwestern district. There were 3 general education teachers, 4 special education teachers from 7 classrooms that agreed to participate. The students were nominated and deemed eligible if the CBMW median score was below 15 correct word sequences or they generated simple repetitive sentences on more than 50% of their CBMW sentences. Students were also included if their Woodcock-Johnson scores on the spelling subtest was below 1 standard deviation of the normative mean. The reliability and validity. Picture word for screening, pre-post testing, and monitoring was used, prompts consisting of 9 words with 3 words per page. There were writing samples were scored using total words written, words spelled correctly, total number of adjacent words spelled and used correctly, and correct minus incorrect word sequences, with a reliability rating of 4400s to 7900s. The Woodcock-Johnson spelling, writing fluency, and writing sample subtests were used for pre- and post-testing. The reliability rating of 0.89 for spelling, 0.86 for writing fluency, 0.84 for writing samples, and 0.94 for broad written language. The fidelity of the DBI was assessed using a modified version of the accuracy of implementation rating scales, or AIRS. There were 5 doctoral students majoring in educational psychology of curriculum and instruction that collected the screening and pre- and post-test results. Most of the examiners were blind to the conditions. Training and fidelity of both the CBMW and Woodcock-Johnson was completed prior to the administration, and fidelity was 100% for both measures. The examiner scored the CBMW after participating in an hour training. An inter-rater agreement ranged from 91.43% to 100% for all scoring procedures. The Woodcock-Johnson spelling subtest was scored by the first author, and then 20% of the scored subtests were scored by another author for inter-scorer reliability. The Woodcock-Johnson writing fluency and writing subtests were scored similarly after the first author provided a 1-hour training session to a doctoral student in special education. Mean inter-rater agreement was 100% for spelling and writing fluency and 90.29% for writing samples. Fidelity of implementation was measured twice, 4 weeks after the DBI began and then 4 weeks later. Audio sessions occurred and were checked. If fidelity fell below a rating of 80%, they would receive corrective feedback and then need to submit another recording. Both fidelity checks were above 88% and additional checks were not needed. The average DBI fidelity check was 95 and 6800% and 95 and 6700%. The study design was a group experimental design due to the random assignment of students into a treatment group or a control group. The results of the study concluded the following. The results showed support for the benefits of DBI for improving students' performance in early writing intervention. In particular, this approach appeared to be more effective for students receiving special education services and interventions focused on handwriting and spelling. They also concluded that the intervention was most beneficial for those students receiving special education services. The scores on the CBMW were significantly higher for students in the treatment group on the post-test, and students at risk also benefited from the treatment. Findings on the Woodcock-Johnson varied more by specific subtests, with the writing fluency subtest having the least effectiveness in both groups. The present study extended the research on writing interventions by delivering the intervention within a DBI framework. There were other studies on DBI frameworks done in reading and math, but there really weren't any completed on a writing intervention. So the previous studies have been done on this particular writing intervention, but never within the DBI framework as well. To date, no research had been conducted on DBI within the writing context. The limitations. Although random assignment was made to treatment groups, a higher mean performance level was noted compared to controls. Because the intervention was delivered as a package, it was hard to determine which dimensions were enhancing the writing performance itself. So the evaluation, what type of preparation would be needed? Because this is something that is implemented with little to no monetary need, I don't see any issues with this strategy being implemented. Training for fidelity to all teachers involved would be needed for scoring reliability and validity, and pre-testing for grade level students to determine as need. What type of training would be needed to implement with fidelity? Well, the RBI article suggested that training occurred, so training for the teachers would be needed, and planning days and collaboration. What would a fair timeline be? This was kind of hard because I guess it just depends on how much data you're already collecting on your students. But I gave them 2 weeks to gather the data and train teachers, 12 weeks for the program itself, and then 1 to 2 weeks to discuss and evaluate the results of the data for success. What would the cost be? The program itself has no cost to it other than the training of the teachers involved. The implementation would be low cost to the school and to my own classroom. And after reading through this article, I was actually intrigued by it and hope to initiate some of the parts of this, since I already do implement some of the parts themselves, like the word study. But because I teach 6th grade, I don't know that there is really a need for the alphabet phonics part of it. But who knows? I have a few students that I would be definitely willing to try it on. Thank you very much.